By the time the chandelier fell, the room already understood who owned the air. I stood at the head of the long oak table in a Manhattan penthouse that belonged, until that hour, to a man whose name was whispered in steakhouse booths and barber shops, like a curse you say softly so it does not hear you. He was sitting across from me, the mobster my wife chose over our marriage vows, the man with the picture-perfect suit and the blood-under-the-nails smile. He kept his hands flat, like a schoolboy, because half of his lieutenants were mine now and the other half could not make eye contact with me. New York glittered through glass walls as if the city itself wanted to watch. I was not supposed to be here. I was supposed to be the man who got embarrassed, crumpled, and outsourced his grief to a whiskey bottle. Instead, I leaned forward into the calm that descends right before a storm breaks open, and I made a promise in a voice I barely recognized as my own. I promised that when I walked out there would be nothing left of his kingdom but invoices and dust. It should be said that the room did not only hold men of this world. The chandelier swayed in a draught that had no source, and in the glass of the windows I could swear I saw reflections that did not belong to anyone in the room, faces from the past and a few from a future that had not yet happened. Conspiracy-minded friends later told me about the building's history, about a prohibition judge who ran a courtroom upstairs where sentences were written in invisible ink and the bailiff spoke to his rosary like it was a radio. I cannot confirm any of that, but that night the air had a charge, like the air that hangs over a baseball stadium in extra innings, when the crowd collectively holds its breath. The mobster laughed in a way meant to lure his courage back from wherever it had run. He called me the handyman who married up and got angry when the pipes burst. He said the city does not take orders from men with calluses. So I described the map of his empire while he listened, the same way an undertaker describes a body's measurements while choosing the right suit. I named the laundromats with the hidden ledgers. I named the charity galas where his envelopes traveled from glittering hand to glittering hand. I named the failing commercial strips he was buying block by block so he could raise them from the dead as sparkling condos, then sweep old tenants into the river of history like crumbs off a tablecloth. I spoke calmly while behind him the elevator dinged, and the last of his loyal men arrived late, read the room, and put their phones face down like men in church. When I finished, he looked smaller, like a magician whose dove forgot its cue. I had not raised my voice. I did not need to. The city already knew that the weight had shifted. When the chandelier let go, it fell like a judge's gavel. No one was hurt. It shattered into 1,000 merciless diamonds, and the room let out the sound a room makes when it discovers its owner is a new man. Even the ice in the glasses stopped clinking. I told him my wife had once asked me why I never decorated our place with fancy light fixtures. Because, I said, beautiful things that hang over your head always think about falling. He wanted to argue. He wanted to accuse me of unfair play, of betrayal, of building something with screws I took from his shed. But he had already taught me that the word betrayal is only a complaint the weak make when they discover that the rules are written in pencil. All that is the end, or near enough to taste it. Now we rewind, because if you want to know how a man becomes larger than he ever dreamed and darker than he ever feared, you must begin with the night he discovered that love, like an expensive chandelier, can fall without warning. You must begin with a parking lot outside a restaurant that serves truffle fries with the same confidence a king wears a crown. You must begin with the particular cold that slips into the bones of a man who has watched his wife climb into another man's car and smile the way she used to smile when she saw him arrive at the door with grocery bags and a plan for Sunday. You must begin with the realization that the American dream does not always end with a backyard and a grill. Sometimes it ends with a ledger, a chessboard, and a city that judges you by the size of your shadow. And even as we travel backward, I will tell you something I did not yet know then. There are networks under the networks, tunnels under the tunnels. There are backroom deals made in diners at 3 in the morning while the cook scrubs the griddle like it owes him money. There are anonymous message boards where the heirs of bootleggers trade advice on how to turn loyalty into currency and fear into a franchise. There are sacred little superstitions that travel with the envelopes and the cigars and the perfectly folded napkins. And there are saints, or if not saints, then patron ghosts. St. Jude for lost causes, St. Matthew for ledgers, St. Valentine for the day you have to break a heart for the good of the family. American myths did not vanish. They simply learned to wear tailored suits. The night everything fell, I did not feel triumphant. I felt accurate, as if the version of me that belonged in this room had been waiting behind a one-way mirror all along, and finally I had turned to face him. I sometimes tell people it began with a receipt. That is not quite true. It began with a story I kept telling myself about who I was. I was a man who came home tired and satisfied, a man who tipped well and listened carefully, a man who believed you build a life one Saturday at a time. If you asked my neighbors, they would say I was the guy who shoveled the sidewalk in winter before the sun came up and returned borrowed tools the same day. My wife, before the late nights, loved that about me. She used to say, "There is a peace in being married to a man with a plan." Then the plan started annoying her. The restaurants got fancier, the dresses got louder, and the silence after her shower grew teeth. She would stand in the mirror arranging a necklace like it was an argument she intended to win. When she began taking calls in the pantry and laughing in a key I had never heard, I told myself marriages go through seasons. I told myself New York rewards ambition, and she was just trying to keep up. The receipt, though, had a name on the merchant line that belonged to a private club by the river, a club the city pretends not to know. I recognized it because a contractor buddy once worked a rush job there and came home with a story about a wall made of bottles, a hostess with eyes like expensive trouble, and men who left without bills because the bills came later in a different language. My wife's charge was for a tasting menu that cost more than a mortgage payment in smaller states. She tried to laugh it off. She said her friend bought dinner and Venmo'd her after. When I asked which friend, she declared that I was interrogating her like a suspect. When I asked why we did not have that much fun together anymore, she said the word need with a sharpness that left a line on the table, as if the word were a blade. She said I did not understand the new city, that I still measured worth in hours worked and not in tables reserved. She told me other people were noticing her, that life might be passing her by. After that came the late text messages, the salon appointments that ran long, the perfume that smelled like a gala and not like us. I hired a private investigator because I was tired of starring in a film where I did not know the script. He was a veteran of the city's small wars, divorces, frauds, missing husbands who had not been kidnapped so much as convinced. He met me in a coffee shop where the pastries looked like they wanted to be famous. He called me sir, like he was being kind to a man who was about to lose a contest to a fact. 2 weeks later, he slid photographs across a Formica booth. There she was, stepping out of a black car in a dress that read like a press release, the mobster's hand on the small of her back as if he was claiming acreage. The man had been around forever. He was one of those names that ride up the elevator of every city decade and always step out smiling. In the photos, he looked like the version of me that she wished could buy her a skyline. It is easy to tell yourself you will be cool in that moment, that you will talk, negotiate, propose counseling, maturely decide how to proceed. But grief has its own language, and the first thing it says is, get out of this room before it ruins you. I drove, without choosing a destination, past billboards that promised dreams if you signed here, past bodega cats who watched me like they had seen 100 men with the same face, past a church whose wooden door seemed to know my name. I wanted to go inside, but the door stayed closed in the way doors do when what you need from them is not sanctuary, but strategy. I slept in my truck by the river with the window cracked and the radio-whispering talk shows that could not decide between apocalypse and baseball scores. At dawn, the city smelled like bread and ambition. I decided that if the story was going to break, it would break my way. People say the underworld recruits you. I do not think that is accurate. I think the underworld auditions you. It asks a simple question: can you carry a story without dropping it? Because this is a city of stories that pay rent. I remembered kids from my neighborhood who went into the wind with gold around their necks and came back at 27 with 2 phones and a bodyguard. I remembered a cousin who managed a strip mall for a gentleman whose name did not appear on any lease, a strip mall that sold tires, tuxedos, and hope in 24-month payment plans. I remembered a foreman who slipped me a tip once. When a man shakes hands with you and holds your eyes too long, he is measuring your usefulness, not your soul. I took a week off and made phone calls that felt like apologies to a younger me who would not have believed the man I was becoming. I shook hands with former rivals of the Mobster, men who smelled like cigar boxes and politely concealed weapons. I bought the guys lunch. I asked intelligent questions. I listened instead of trying to sound like I knew everything. That is how a city opens a small door, and then, if you do not flinch, a larger one. What did I believe in then? Hard work, obviously, and the survival instinct that lives in the bones of anyone who has ever watched a bill arrive on a Friday and needed a miracle by Monday. I also began to believe in something more cinematic. There were rumors of a ledger that had survived 4 bosses, a leather book kept in a safe behind a portrait of a saint who never existed, a ledger that tracked who owed whom down to the nickname. There were whispers of an accountant who only met at dawn in a particular diner and communicated through chess moves, of a storage unit filled with paintings nobody could display because the provenance would bring police like moths to light. Conspiracy, yes, but in America, conspiracies are often just business plans with better costumes. I decided I would not only survive my wife's betrayal, I would make it the forge that shaped the man I would introduce to the city when the time came. The story would not break my spine. It would give me a new one made of something the city respects: results. People misremember my rise as quick. It was not quick. It was precise. I learned to measure my outline on a wall before trying to walk through it. The first play was humble. A failing card room above a bowling alley in Queens had a leak in the ceiling and a leak in the books. I offered to fix both. I brought in new tables, new security cameras, and a new rule. Everybody plays by the same math. I invited veterans to run the place with me and gave them a cut that made their wives stop asking when they were going to look for honest work. Word traveled that I paid on time and did not make men beg. The card room became a small empire disguised as a hobby. The city noticed in the way it notices a new bakery. Suddenly, the line moved faster and the product tasted clean. Then came a protection route that had become protection theater. A handful of shops were paying for pretend safety to a crew that drove loud cars and delivered nothing but anxiety. I terminated the contract by offering the merchants something radical: silence. My guys wore plain jackets, drank coffee from paper cups, and learned the shop owners' kids' names. We took care of problems before they had to be named. The shop owners called me by my first name. They brought me cannoli on Fridays. That matters in a city built on the gravitational pull of personal allegiance. Meanwhile, I learned the tax code like it was a novel. I hired an attorney who had suffered one humiliating defeat in a courtroom and wanted to spend the rest of his career turning the world into a balance sheet he could dominate. Wealth and power, properly arranged, produce invisibility. We invested in waste management, in janitorial services, in temporary employment agencies that actually paid benefits, because respect grows in the soil of reasonable stability. I did not do it alone. I found allies who had been living in the mobster's weather for too long. There was a woman named Teresa who ran a logistics yard in Brooklyn with the precision of a symphony conductor. She had lost a brother to a debt that was never fully explained, and she wanted a new management style that did not punish loyalty for sport. There was a quiet man everyone called Uncle, not because of age, but because he made everyone feel like there was a family that would not sell them at the first hint of trouble. There was a pastor who worked with us unofficially, steering kids toward union apprenticeships instead of nighttime romances with easy money. There was an old tailor in the garment district who sent messages the old way. A particular stitch on a jacket sleeve that meant yes, a different stitch that meant no, and a missing button that meant run. As for my wife, she evolved from grievance to prop to rumor. She began appearing in society pages at the edge of photographs, a gloss of champagne on her lip and a dress that tried to argue with gravity. The mobster liked to show her like a new car he planned to drive only on Sundays. I received a few texts. Some said I was a coward for not fighting for her. Some said I had become cruel. One suggested lunch to talk like adults. I learned that you can save a screenshot and delete a person at the same time. I also learned that grief, when it is not fed, becomes strategy. I filled my days with so much precision that the night arrived like a receipt for services rendered. I slept, I woke, I built, and the city began to understand. Respectable men in unrespectable businesses began to ask if they could send their problems to me instead of to the man whose brand had become vintage. The mobster had a style that smelled like the last decade's cologne. I had a style that smelled like tomorrow's paperwork. You want mythology? Here it is. On an August night, a driver brought me to a warehouse by the water where the city stores remnants of itself. Neon letters from dead diners, ticket booths from ferries that no longer cross, a carousel horse whose eyes still believe in music. There, an old man unrolled a canvas and showed me a painting nobody could hang. He asked for a price so absurd I almost laughed. He said that if I could make the money move, without anyone hearing it, I would have proven that I could lift heavier things. It took me 13 days. The painting moved across 3 state lines, 2 shells, and 1 charity auction, where the bidders believed they were supporting literacy. In return, I asked for introductions I had no right to ask for. Doors opened. I did not bow. The city admires a man who understands its appetite for impossible errands and its reverence for completion. By winter, the mobster called me. He wanted a sit-down that felt like a lecture he planned to give. He said he had tolerated my ambition because he found it adorable, like a child in his father's shoes, but that the time had come to return to reality. He offered me a stipend. He offered me a territory that had been plucked clean of profit. He offered me the dignity of being allowed to keep my face. I told him the only thing of his I wanted was the one thing he did not know he had lost, the belief that he was immune to gravity. He hung up in a fury that sounded like an engine failing to start. After that, strange things began happening in his world. A banker decided to retire in the middle of a Tuesday. A cousin refused to pick up the phone. A warehouse lease was not renewed by a landlord who suddenly discovered a family history of philanthropy. You could call it conspiracy. I call it the American ecosystem adjusting itself after a long, dull ache. By spring, I had 3 rooms in 3 neighborhoods where the air felt like my home air. Men sat up straighter when I arrived, not because they feared a bullet, but because they knew their projects would finish under budget and ahead of schedule. The city adores competence almost as much as it adores drama. I supplied both in measured doses. I would love to tell you that I did not change, that the same man who shoveled sidewalks simply put on a better coat. That would be dishonest. I sharpened. I made decisions with a swiftness that might look cruel from the outside. I taught myself to hear a lie the way a musician hears an off note. I did not brag. Silence is the most terrifying adjective. If you carry it correctly, it makes rooms rearrange themselves around you. We returned to the penthouse with its fallen chandelier and its owner, who was already grieving a future that had been repossessed by the present. The reckoning did not feel like an action movie. It felt like a real estate closing conducted by ghosts. I had arranged a chain of collapses that required no shouting. A supplier discovered that his trucks would not be loaded today or tomorrow. A permitting office found irregularities that had been invisible for years and now glowed like emergency flares. An insurance underwriter sent an email that read like a farewell note to a party that had gone on too long. None of this was magic. It was strategy and patience wearing black tie. My people called me with updates in the vocabulary of victory: delivered, filed, signed, recorded. The mobster stared at the table as if numbers might suddenly begin to care about his reputation. My wife sat on a velvet couch that seemed to swallow her and tried to play the part of the queen whose court knows better than to make eye contact. When she finally spoke, she asked me a question that sounded like a child asking the weather to stop raining. She asked why I could not just walk away and let him keep what was his. I told her he had taught me that nothing belongs to anyone forever, that ownership in this city is a story we repeat until the story discovers a better narrator. I told her she had made a choice, and I had made another. She looked at me as if I were a stranger, which was accurate. I had become a person whose conviction did not need volume. The mobster attempted gravitas. He stood, unbuttoned his jacket as if oxygen lived in there, and tried to sell me the one commodity that had always worked for him: legend. He told me about the old days, about nights when cops held doors, about honor as if it were a marina where only certain yachts could dock. He told me men like me come and go. It was almost convincing if you did not know the city recycles legends the way it recycles bottles, melting them down and reshaping them in new molds. I replied with dates, addresses, and routing numbers. I replied with the names of his men who were now tired of being the punchline after the checks cleared. I replied with the map of a future in which he would not starve, but would have to shake hands with the reality that he had been replaced by a version of himself that wore silence like a suit. If you want fantasy, here is the only magic trick I performed. I did not finish him. Everyone expected me to. Men like him do not retire. They are retired by force. But I had come to respect a deeper law of the ecosystem. Destruction is expensive. Ruin is cheap. I chose ruin. I arranged for him to keep one property that looks respectable on paper and hemorrhages cash in private, a philanthropic foundation that receives more envelopes than it sends, and a circle of friends who smile at him like waiters who have already decided what tip he will leave. He would wake up every morning inside a museum of his former life, the exhibitions maintained by interns on thin budgets and thinner patience. He would have enough to remember, not enough to command. That is a punishment you cannot buy on any menu. It must be designed, measured, and installed with the care of a light fixture hung precisely over the table where the family meets and tells itself that everything is still fine. As for my wife, I granted her what the law calls a fair settlement and the culture calls a lesson. She kept the furniture she loved and the friends who loved her for it. She kept the Instagram that proves to strangers that a life is occurring. She lost the gravity that keeps a person steady when the music changes. She would be seen in the right rooms for a while and then begin to understand that rooms are not right or wrong. They are simply occupied by people who either generate their own weather or are carried by someone else's. I did not gloat. I did not deliver a speech. Sometimes the most American ending is the quiet fade-out that lets the credits roll while the audience whispers about whether the hero did the right thing. When I finally walked out of that penthouse, the elevator carried me like a verdict. I stepped onto a sidewalk where the city was doing what it always does, selling coffee and hope. A paperboy who should have been a teenager with a startup shouted headlines about a politician who had discovered an ethics committee was not metaphoric. A woman in scrubs held a bag of groceries like a trophy she had earned honestly. A bus knelt to let a man climb aboard with his dignity intact. I felt an odd tenderness toward the place. I had become the thing I feared and admired, a man who could shape outcomes at a distance. I also felt the weight of it. Power is a pet that must be walked every day. If you do not, it chews the furniture and ruins the carpet. Later that week, I visited the church whose door had judged me. This time it opened. I sat in the back, beneath a stained glass window, where a saint I did not recognize held a ledger in one hand and a lily in the other. I did not pray for forgiveness. I asked for accuracy. I asked to remain the kind of man who knows how easily a chandelier falls. The priest did not approach. The candles did not flicker in secret codes. I left a donation and stepped back into the weather. There are those who will file this as one of those revenge stories that make the rounds, a tale told in diners after midnight and on message boards where people argue about morality like it is a sport. Let them. This city eats, and if you want to survive, you must learn to cook. I did not only cook, I wrote the menu. If you want a final moral, here it is in American plain speech. Betrayal is a curriculum. You can repeat the class forever, complaining about the teacher, or you can graduate and open a school. I opened a school. The alumni list is short and very selective. The tuition is paid in precision. The motto is simple. Do not shout, do not shake, do not miss. And as for the man who once believed that weekends were enough, he still lives in here somewhere, mowing the lawn of a small memory. On certain Sundays, I let him out, and we grill and we laugh, and we promise to hang nothing above our heads that we are not prepared to see on the floor.